Interdevelopmental Institute. And today I want to speak about cognitive coaching. I want to speak about how you boost the client's thinking, whether he's a coachee or a mentee. And this is a kind of coaching work that is not often done, but is taught here at IBM. And I want to give you a few examples. We speak of dialectical thinking in contrast to logical thinking. And the two are not separate because in order to do dialectical thinking, you need logical thinking. So what do I mean by dialectical thinking? I mean what I would call deep thinking, where you pay attention to the structure of either your own thinking or your client's thinking. So you're not exclusively or mainly listen to the content of what is said, as we usually do, but you're listening to how the content is expressed in terms of what I call thought forms. And what are thought forms? Thought forms are abstractions like unceasing change or part of a whole or limits of separation between two things or lack of stability. And in DTF, the dialectical thought form framework, there are actually 28 thought forms that are divided into 4 classes. And I'm not going to use all of them here. Indeed, in my book I'm writing right now about DTF, I'm using only 12. So how are they divided? That means we have different forms or kinds of thought forms. So when I speak to you, I'm using thought forms, and so do you when you speak to me. And I can ask the question, if you are my coachee, what kind of thought form is my coachee using right now? And I can look at that. It's very helpful in coaching, and I can then make the coachee aware of that. So for instance, if you describe your job to me in static terms without speaking much about the process of your work or the relationship in which it stands to other things in the company you work for, I would say my client right now is speaking in context thought forms. By context, I mean static configurations that you can describe systems in. You can speak of part and whole, you can speak of layers of the system, functions, you can speak of different perspectives you can take on the system. So you can talk about the system from the outside, from the inside, whatever you want. And that's how most conversations go, that we don't think of change happening all the time, unceasing change. We don't think much usually of how relationships define what we are talking about. And I will give an example for that later. So when I'm coaching somebody who describes or speaks to me in terms of context thought forms, static configurations, I'm thinking, what would my coachee be able to think new in a new way if I asked him a process question, or if I asked him a relationship question, or if I asked him a transformational question? So these are the 4 classes to which I'm distinguishing here: context, process, relationship, and transformation. And each of these classes, which are also referred to as the moments of dialectic, each of these has a particular way of waking up the mind, for which reason I call them mind openers. And if you take them to heart and you use these mind openers, they actually become door openers because they make you do things in a way different from what you would otherwise do. So let's say I have a coachee before me who speaks about being in a particular department of the company or division and speaking and working with a team. And he's describing to me the task of the team, um, or maybe the team members. But let's stay with the task. So he's saying, my team right now has the task to develop a logo for our advertising that is global at the same time that it is geared to the particular countries we are working in. And we are discussing, for instance, whether the logo should be articulated in English or in particular uh, different languages and so forth. So, and then he's saying, well, I don't get too well on with this team. Right now, the team is stuck, it seems to me. And I wonder what you would suggest I can do to work with the team better. So I listen to that. And as a coach, I then think, okay, this is a context description of the task. And in some sense, also of the team. So how can I now use a mind opener, a dialectical thought form? And dialectic here relates to dialogue. It really means we are in dialogue and we want to have some fluidity in the way we think together, talk together, and look at the world, because that's what we do when we are talking. We have a certain notion of the world. So then I ask him, I use a process thought form as a mind opener. For instance, I might say, you told me you have this and this deadline for accomplishing the task. Um, what do you think would happen if that deadline would be shortened and you would have to do it a month earlier? So then my coachee would have to begin thinking in terms of time and things to do within that time window, which would be different. Now, maybe a better question would be to ask him, what would happen if the task you and the team have taken on would have been restricted to the country you are in instead of being a global logo? Um, would your process in the team have been different? So that might evoke some ideas on his part. He would be able to put in brackets all the internationally relevant issues that have to do with the logo. And the thinking process he would share with me and that we would work on would be different. I could also ask questions about time, um, but process has a broader meaning than time. It has the meaning of whatever is in motion. So whatever is in motion in my client's task is of interest to me because I can ask him questions about it and make him think in a way that he doesn't do. Now here's where the difference between logic and dialectic comes in the sense that dialectical thinking is thinking in terms of process, context, relationship, and transformation. Logical thinking is largely thinking only in terms of context. Because in logical thinking, we are looking at wholes, we are dividing them into parts, we talk about how they relate, but it's all static. We are not, logic is not very helpful when it comes to asking process questions. And it's also not really very helpful if we ask relationship questions, although we can say, well, this links to that and so forth. But here we must remember that relationship in dialectic has a different meaning than in logic. Relationship in dialectic has to do with intrinsic relationship. In other words, two things are at the same time internally related, not just externally, um, and they form a common ground. They belong together into the same ballpark, let's say, it means. So, for instance, if you think of your job in relationship to the department as a whole, it will be easy for you to understand that your task is dependent on and defined by the department you are in. So there is an intrinsic relationship between you and the department or division you are in. And if that or when that relationship changes, your task or the meaning of your task also changes. And so when he speaks of his work with his team, I could ask him as a relationship question. And I could say, well, how do you think you would work with a team differently if this team was in or had to be in communication with another team in the marketing field that was not concerned with the logo but with something else? So then we have two teams and their relationship to cope with in the coaching. And so this would bring my coachee to think in different ways. So I now have shown you how I would work listening to my coachee and thinking about what question, what thought form do I need to use to make my coachee think differently about what he's telling me. I could have chosen the example of my coachee looking for a solution to something, which might have been more potent. But I would equally have brought in the process thought forms, the relationship thought forms. Now, what is transformation? Transformational thought forms having to do not only with the passing of time and process and relationships, but they tie together context, process, and relationship. And since the more complex, let's say, a division of the company or a company itself becomes, the more it is fragile. The more complex something is, the more fragile it is, the more changes can occur, and the more transformations take place. So if I want to think of something in terms of transformation, I have to know about it in the way that it changes over time, in terms of process. I have to think about it in terms of what it is, defined as in somewhat static terms. And I have to think about what are the internal relationships in the task, sub-goals, you might say, or people, different people working on different tasks. It could have different meanings that we are choosing. And only if I can think about something like a task in terms of process, context and relationship together, can I think of it as being in transformation? Because it could be, that the competition that we are having or are dealing with in our company for which we are designing a logo suddenly comes up with a very different approach to the market to which we then have to respond in our logo. So we would have to use transformational thought forms. Let's say a competitor would move into many of the countries we have up to now had a monopoly for. Then the logo would have to be very different. So the logo is not something cast in stone, but it has to be thought again and again and thought over in terms of the transformation that may occur within the next 2 or 3 or 5 years, or even a single year ahead of us. Um, and that should actually be part of the thinking on the logo, that we think about potential transformations, because otherwise we could not anticipate the future. And so in this short video, I've given you just an inkling of what cognitive coaching is. Where I, as a coach, I know my dialectical thought form framework taught here at IEM. I know my thought forms, and I'm a very good listener in the sense that I can listen not only to myself very well, but also to my client. And actually, often I would close my eyes to hear more intensively what the client is saying. And what I'm doing there, is I'm making a distinction between the content of what the client is telling me and the structure. And the structure is the thought forms. The structure is composed of a sequence of thought forms. And I'm listening to the structure. I'm not listening primarily to the content. And that is what I mean by dialectical coaching, by cognitive coaching using dialectic. If you're interested in that, look at our website, uh, interdevelopmentals with an s.org. We have courses in which you can learn this kind of thinking. And right now I'm writing a book about it called Integral Dialectical Thinking for Integral Leaders, a primer or primer. And you might be interested in this book that comes out in June to see for yourself what you could gain by using dialectical thought forms. So thank you for listening to me today. And if you want to ask me questions about it, feel free to write to otto@interdevelopmentals.org. Have a good day. Thank you very much.